Listen, the sound of a catastrophic mechanical failure isn't just a noise. It's a physical weight that settles into the marrow of a man's bones. And for Silas Vance, that weight felt like a tombstone. It happened at exactly 6:14 in the morning, right as the pale, weak light of late April started to bleed across the Nebraska horizon, turning the saturated lowlands into a shimmering, deceptive mirror of silver and gray. Silas was up in the cab of his 1978 Caterpillar D9H, a machine that had more hours on it than most men have in their careers, trying to clear a stubborn shelf of limestone that blocked the drainage path for his south acreage. The ground was a treacherous soup, the result of a particularly brutal spring thaw that had turned the rich topsoil into a bottomless slurry of clay and grit. He shifted the massive lever, feeling the familiar vibration of the big diesel engine thrumming through his seat. But when he dropped the blade and pushed, there wasn't the usual grunt of power. Instead, there was a sound like a high-caliber rifle shot, a sickening metallic crack that echoed off the valley walls. The left final drive had literally detonated under the strain, sending a shrapnel cloud of hardened steel through the casing and dumping 40 gallons of hot black oil directly into the April mud. The massive yellow beast lurched to one side, sinking instantly into the soft earth until the tracks were buried, leaving Silas stranded in a dead 80,000-pound paperweight while the smell of burnt gear oil and ozone filled the crisp morning air. It was the kind of failure that doesn't just stop a day's work, it ends a legacy, especially when the bank is already circling like a buzzard over a dying calf. The humiliation didn't take long to arrive, pulling up the long gravel drive in the form of two pristine, white Ford Expeditions that looked entirely too clean for this part of the county. Out stepped the men from the Transcontinental Railroad, led by a man named Sterling, who wore a tailored wool coat that probably cost more than Silas's entire tool shed. They didn't even look at the mud on their Italian leather shoes as they walked toward the edge of the field where Silas stood, grease-stained and shaking with a mix of exhaustion and silent fury. Sterling didn't offer a handshake. He just looked at the sunken caterpillar, a thin, pitying smile playing on his lips as he adjusted his glasses against the glare of the rising April sun. He told Silas that the board had authorized one final goodwill offer for the 300 acres of scrubland and rocky hills that sat directly in the path of the new high-speed freight corridor. $50,000. It was an insult, a pittance that wouldn't even cover the cost of a new final drive for the D9, let alone the debts piling up on the kitchen table back at the farmhouse. Sterling spoke with the polished, rhythmic cadence of a man who was used to winning, explaining that the land was technically worthless, a geological headache that the railroad would have to spend millions to stabilize. He called the $50,000 a mercy payment, a way for Silas to walk away with his dignity before the eminent domain lawyers started their slow, grinding machinery. Silas looked at the man's clean hands and then down at his own, where the black oil of the cat's lifeblood was already staining his callous skin. And for a moment, the weight of the debt and the broken steel felt like it might finally crush the breath out of him. But there is a specific kind of stubbornness that grows in a man who has spent 40 years fighting the weather and the markets. A refusal to lie down, even when the dirt is already being shoveled over his head. Silas looked past the suits and the shiny SUVs, out toward the ridge where the limestone shelf broke the surface like the spine of some ancient buried dragon. He knew this land better than he knew his own children. He knew the way the water moved through the hidden fissures, and the way the deep frost of winter always seemed to push up strange, heavy stones from the dark. The railroad wanted this path because it was the only level grade for 50 miles, but they were treating him like a nuisance to be cleared, a relic of a dying era that had no place in their master plan. As the wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of the turning season and the damp earth, Silas felt a cold, hard clarity settle over him. He told Sterling to get back in his truck and to tell his masters that the price of his heritage hadn't changed, and it sure as hell wasn't for sale at a discount. The suits laughed, a dry, hollow sound that was lost in the vastness of the prairie, and as they drove away, leaving him alone with his broken machine and his mounting despair, they had no idea that the very failure that seemed to signal his end was actually the first step toward a discovery that would change the map of the state forever. Silas climbed back onto the fender of the dead Caterpillar, the metal cold through his jeans, and began to wipe the oil from the casing, his eyes fixed on the jagged white rock where the final drive had met its end, sensing that something more than just bad luck was buried beneath the Nebraska clay. The vultures didn't wait for the sun to set. By the following afternoon, a massive, heavy-duty recovery rig from Miller's Heavy Haul, a contractor known for being the railroad's preferred muscle, was backing down the narrow access road, the air brakes hissing like a warning. Miller himself, a man who looked like he was carved out of cheap granite in bad intentions, stepped out of the rig and didn't even look Silas in the eye. He just stared at the sunken D9H, calculated the angle of the pull, and handed Silas a clipboard with a quote that made his vision blur. $15,000 just to winch the machine out of the mire, and another 10 to haul it to a shop 60 miles away. Miller knew Silas didn't have the liquid cash, and he knew the bank had already frozen the farm's line of credit. The timing was too perfect to be an accident. The railroad was tightening the noose, using every local lever they could pull to ensure Silas was paralyzed. If he couldn't move the cat, he couldn't finish the drainage. If he couldn't finish the drainage, the 300 acres would remain a useless marsh, and he'd miss the May 10th planting deadline for his corn crop. In the world of Nebraska agriculture, missing that date isn't just a setback, it's a death sentence, voiding the federal crop insurance and leaving the farmer exposed to every whim of a volatile market. Silas stood there in the wind, the scent of damp earth and diesel hanging heavy in the air, realizing that he wasn't just fighting for a piece of land, he was fighting a coordinated siege designed to starve him out before the first sprout even broke the surface. The pressure didn't stop at the property line. By Monday morning, the local implement dealer, a man Silas had done business with for 30 years, refused to even order the replacement parts for the final drive without full payment up front, citing new corporate policy and credit risk assessments that smelled like a script written in a boardroom 1,000 miles away. Then came Henderson, the railroad site foreman, a man who lacked Sterling's polished veneer and replaced it with raw, bureaucratic aggression. Henderson didn't talk about goodwill or mercy. He talked about court orders, eminent domain, and the sheriff's department. He stood on the edge of the muddy field, gesturing toward the ridge with a heavy-gloved hand, telling Silas that the state had already preliminary approved the corridor, and that every day Silas delayed was a day they'd bill him for in lost construction time. The mercy payment of $50,000 was still on the table, but Henderson made it clear it was shrinking with every hour the D9H sat in the mud. He called Silas an obstacle to progress, a stubborn old man holding onto a pile of rocks that would never grow a decent ear of corn again. The humiliation was a physical ache, a tightness in Silas's chest as he watched the foreman survey the land like it was already his. The neighbors started to notice too. The whispers at the feed store were about how Silas Vance had finally bitten off more than he could chew, and how the pride that had sustained the Vance family for 4 generations was finally going to be their undoing. As the first week of May approached, the sky turned a bruised, heavy purple, promising more rain that Silas couldn't afford. The deadline for the bank's quarterly interest payment was 48 hours away, and the D9H remained a yellow tombstone in the center of his most valuable field. Miller's crew was still parked at the gate, refusing to move until the winching fee was paid, effectively blocking Silas from even trying to bring in a smaller, leased tractor to attempt a desperate, last-minute planting on the higher ground. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, surrounded by men who saw him as nothing more than a line item to be erased. He spent that night in the shop, the air cold and smelling of old grease in desperation, staring at the blueprints of the D9's powertrain and the topographical maps of his ridge. He wasn't looking for a way to pay the debt anymore. He was looking for a way to fight back with the only things he had left. A set of rusted tools, a lifetime of mechanical intuition, and a suspicion that had been gnawing at him since the moment that final drive had shattered against the limestone. He knew that rock shouldn't have been there, not that deep and not that hard. It wasn't just limestone, it was something else, something that had been waiting for millions of years to be uncovered by a desperate man and a broken machine. The railroad wanted the path, but Silas was starting to think they wanted what was under it even more. And he'd be damned if he'd let them take it without a fight that would shake the foundations of the entire county. Silas didn't look at the recovery crew again. He walked back to the machine shed, past the rows of newer, idle equipment, to a corner covered in heavy canvas and 20 years of dust. Beneath the tarp sat a relic from a different era, a custom-built, PTO-driven winch assembly his father had fabricated from the rear end of a scrapped M4 Sherman tank after the war. It was a mechanical beast of pure torque, designed for a world where you didn't call a tow truck, you built a solution. As the rain started to fall in a cold, needle-like drizzle typical of early May, Silas spent 6 hours in the dark, his hands numb and slick with kerosene, stripping the old grease and checking the massive planetary gears. He wasn't just planning to move the cat, he was planning to excavate the very thing that had broken it. He remembered his grandfather talking about the heavy ground on the ridge, ground that stayed cold longer in the spring and killed the drill bits of every well driller who ever tried to find water there. He grabbed a heavy pry bar and a geologist's hammer he'd kept since his brief stint in a mining camp 40 years ago. Returning to the mud-choked D9H, he ignored Henderson's shouts from the fence line. He crawled under the massive steel belly of the machine, reaching into the cavity where the final drive had exploded. Among the jagged shards of cat steel, he found what he was looking for, a chunk of the limestone that hadn't shattered. It was a dull metallic gray, flecked with iridescent streaks of deep violet and copper. It was twice as heavy as it should have been, and when he struck it with the hammer, it didn't crack, it rang like a bell. The technical pivot wasn't just about moving the machine, it was about out-engineering the railroad's blockade. Silas knew he couldn't fix the final drive in the mud, but he could limp the machine if he could get the shattered gears to stop binding. He used an old-school field fix known as pinning the sun gear, a dangerous, improvised maneuver that involved welding the remaining internal hub to the outer casing, essentially turning the left track into a solid, unmoving sled. By doing this, he could use the right track's power and the Sherman winch, anchored to a massive 100-year-old oak tree on the ridge, to pivot the 80,000-pound machine out of its grave. It was a symphony of stress in steel. The winch cable, a 2-inch thick braided steel snake, groaned under the tension until it started to hum a terrifying, high-pitched note. The engine of his backup tractor, an old International 1066 he'd rigged to the winch, screamed at the top of its lungs, throwing a thick plume of black smoke into the gray May sky. Slowly, agonizingly, the D9H began to move. The earth didn't just give way, it groaned as the limestone shelf was scraped bare by the cat's belly pan. As the machine loped forward, a massive slab of the gray-violet rock was forced upward, breaking through the mud like a breaching whale. Silas stopped the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. He walked over to the exposed slab, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't a geological fluke. This was a massive, high-grade vein of chalcopyrite enriched with rare earth tellurium, minerals essential for the very high-speed rail and tech grid the railroad was trying to build. The diagnosis was confirmed when Silas retreated to his shop and pulled out an old bottle of nitric acid and a high-precision scale. The results were undeniable. The railroad hadn't chosen this path because it was level. They had mapped this deposit years ago using satellite gravimetry and kept it quiet, hoping to seize the land for pennies under the guise of transportation infrastructure. They knew the mineral rights on this specific parcel hadn't been severed from the surface rights back in the 1920s, a rare oversight in this part of the country. By forcing him into a mercy sale for $50,000, they would have legally acquired the rights to a deposit that, based on the sheer scale of the ridge's geological formation, was worth $500 million at current market rates. The limestone that broke his tractor was the crown of a mountain of wealth. Silas sat on his workbench, the acidic smoke from the test curling in the air, realizing the depth of the deception. The dealer refusing parts, the bank freezing his credit, Miller's recovery rig blocking the gate. It was all a coordinated effort to ensure he couldn't see what was right beneath his feet. But they had underestimated the mechanical soul of a farmer. They thought a broken tractor would be his end, but that broken gear had acted like a key in a lock. He looked out the window at the ridge, where the rain was washing the mud off the gray-violet stone, and for the first time in months, Silas Vance wasn't afraid of the debt. He was the owner of the most valuable piece of dirt in the Midwest, and he was about to turn the railroad's own legal machinery against them. The news of Silas's insanity traveled to the county faster than a summer storm, and by Tuesday morning the shoulder of the county road was lined with the dusty pickups of neighbors who had come to witness what they thought was the final act of a tragedy. They watched from a distance as Silas, his face etched with a grim, soot-stained resolve, stood by the massive, up-ended slab of gray-violet rock, the Sherman winch still humming with the residual heat of its labor. Among the crowd were the very men who had whispered behind his back at the diner. The local banker, a man named Gable who had already drafted the foreclosure notices for the Vance estate, and a dozen other farmers who saw Silas as a cautionary tale of what happens when you refuse to bend to the inevitable. They saw a man who had broken his best machine, ruined his credit, and seemingly lost his mind over a ridge of scrubland. But the atmosphere shifted when the two white expeditions returned, trailing a black sedan that bore the unmistakable seal of the State Land Commission. Sterling stepped out, flanked by a team of lawyers carrying leather briefcases that looked more like weapons of war than legal documents. He didn't see the rock at first. He only saw the D9H move 50 feet from its original position, and a look of cold, bureaucratic annoyance crossed his face. He began to read from a prepared statement, his voice amplified by the natural bowl of the valley, declaring that the grace period had expired and that the railroad was now moving to seize the property under emergency transit statutes. He spoke of the greater good and the wheels of progress, treating the gathered neighbors as a jury for a trial that had already been decided in a boardroom 1,000 miles away, essentially burying Silas while he was still standing. Silas didn't interrupt the performance. He waited until Sterling reached the part about the nominal compensation for the geologically unstable wasteland before he reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a heavy, industrial-grade core sampling drill he'd borrowed from a retired surveyor down in the valley. With a slow, deliberate motion that commanded the sudden, sharp silence of everyone present, he didn't point to the tractor or the mud. He pointed to the jagged, metallic vein that now stood exposed in the bright morning light like a raw nerve. He didn't address the lawyers. He invited the state land commissioner, a man whose professional curiosity outweighed his political loyalties, to step across the fence and take a closer look at the limestone that had supposedly made the land worthless. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the cab of the dead caterpillar. The commissioner knelt in the mud, his magnifying loupe pressed against the iridescent streaks, and as he performed a quick field density test and applied a drop of reagent, the color drained from Sterling's face in a way that no amount of corporate training could hide. The shift in the air was palpable, a physical transition from the predatory confidence of the railroad executives to the sudden, vibrating panic of men who realized they had been caught in a multi-billion-dollar lie. Silas didn't need to shout. His voice was a low, steady rumble that carried over the heads of the crowd, explaining exactly what he'd found and why the railroad had been so desperate to keep his credit frozen and his tractors broken. He wasn't just a farmer protecting a fence line anymore. He was the man who had just exposed a massive corporate conspiracy to defraud the state and its citizens of a strategic mineral reserve that the world was starving for. The skeptics in the crowd, the men who had come to watch Silas lose everything, began to climb over the fence, their faces transforming from pity to a fierce, protective pride that only those who work the land can truly understand. Gable, the banker, suddenly found himself tucking his foreclosure papers back into his pocket, his posture shifting as he realized the man he was about to ruin was now the most significant depositor his bank would ever see, and likely the new owner of the very ground the bank sat on. The reputation of Silas Vance, which had been dragged through the dirt by rumors of senility and financial ruin, was instantly forged into something legendary. The local hero who had stood his ground against the most powerful entity in the state and won by using their own greed as a lever. Henderson, the foreman who had threatened Silas with the sheriff, tried to step forward to reclaim the narrative, but he was met with a wall of broad-shouldered farmers who had spent their lives being squeezed by the same corporate interests and were more than happy to stand in his way. There was no violence, just the overwhelming weight of public witness and the undeniable truth of the stone that Silas had pulled from the dark. The railroad's lawyers began to whisper frantically among themselves, their mercy payment now looking like a pathetic criminal joke in the face of the geological reality Silas had unearthed. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the deep violet heart of the ridge, the power dynamic of the entire county had been permanently rewritten, and the man they called a relic was the only one standing with the keys to the future, while the giants who tried to crush him were left scrambling for a way to save their own skins from the fallout of their discovery. The legal fallout was swift and devastating for the men in the white SUVs. But for Silas Vance, the victory didn't feel like a payday. It felt like a restoration of the natural order. Once the state land commissioner's report hit the attorney general's desk, the railroad's emergency seizure attempt collapsed under the weight of its own deception, transforming overnight from a land grab into a criminal investigation for corporate fraud and mineral rights suppression. The final settlement was a number that would have made Silas's grandfather's head spin, a deal that allowed the railroad to purchase only the narrowest possible easement at a premium price, while Silas retained 100% of the subsurface rights and a staggering royalty on the tellurium extraction that would begin that autumn. The mercy payment of $50,000 was replaced by a trust that ensured the Vance farm would never see a foreclosure notice again, and Gable, the banker who had been so eager to sign the papers, was forced to personally handle the opening of the farm's new, high-yield investment accounts. Silas didn't buy a fleet of brand-new, plastic-heavy tractors with his first check. Instead, he paid off every debt in the county for the neighbors who had stood on that ridge with him, quietly erasing the financial burdens of the families who had refused to look away when the railroad tried to bury one of their own. By the time the late May heat began to shimmer over the horizon, the pressure of the debt had evaporated, replaced by a deep, resonant peace that had been missing from the valley for decades. The mechanical soul of the story found its closure in the quiet of Silas's shop, where the 1978 Caterpillar D9H underwent a transformation that was more of a resurrection than a repair. Silas didn't send the machine to a dealer. He rebuilt it himself, using the finest aerospace-grade steel for the new final drive components and hand-polishing every bolt until the yellow beast looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line in Peoria. He kept the limestone slab that had shattered the original gears, mounting a polished piece of the violet-flecked ore on the dashboard as a permanent reminder of the day the Earth fought back on his behalf. When he finally fired up the massive diesel engine, the sound was a pure, rhythmic thunder that echoed across the ridge, a signal to the entire county that the guardian of the land was back in the seat. He used the cat to finish the drainage project, turning the once useless marsh into the most productive acreage in the state. And as he pushed the final load of dirt to level the grade, the machine didn't struggle or groan. It moved with a smooth, unstoppable power, as if the very ground it was shaping was cooperating with the man who had protected its secrets. The D9H became a local legend, a rolling testament to the idea that some things are built to last, provided they are steered by a man with the patience to listen to what the metal is trying to tell him. The practical lesson for every man and woman who works the dirt or turns a wrench is simple. Never let the person who wants to buy your legacy define its value. Silas Vance proved that the most dangerous weapon a person can possess isn't a legal team or a billion-dollar budget. It's the stubborn, technical intuition of someone who knows their equipment and their history well enough to know when they're being lied to. A broken machine isn't always a disaster. Sometimes it's a diagnostic tool the universe uses to show you exactly where the gold is buried. He taught the Valley that being old school isn't about being stuck in the past. It's about having a foundation so solid that the winds of corporate greed can't even make it flinch. As the sun set on the final day of planting, Silas sat on his porch, watching the shadows of the ridge stretch long and dark over the cornfields, knowing that the soil beneath his feet was no longer a burden, but a sanctuary. He had kept his word, he had kept his land, and he had proven that in a world of temporary things, there is still a place for the man who says, never, and has the steel to back it up. The legacy of the Vance farm was no longer written in red ink, but in the deep, shimmering violet of the stone that had saved it. What's the most valuable thing you've ever discovered in the middle of a total disaster?